All right, and today we're going to be talking a little bit more about how to deal with text. Now, we've already loaded up everything into Inkscape in terms of it's all loaded up on the screen. Let's go ahead and create a name. For this video, we're going to choose the name Bob, and there's a reason I choose Bob. We'll go into the details of it afterwards, and you'll see as we go along. First thing we're going to do is expand Bob out. Like we did with the auto shapes, by hitting Control, we can actually have scalable expansion. So if I didn't, you can make Bob look however you want Bob to look like. But hitting Control, make sure that Bob looks right when we do expand him out. So I'm going to go ahead and make Bob about 12 inches, a little over that there, down to about 12 inches there. Now you can also manually select the size of Bob or your letters or your text by going up here and selecting, well, you know, my width is going to be X amount, and you can change your W and your H, and by hitting the lock we preserve that perspective. So I'm going to say 12 inches, and it expands it out properly, and it just auto adjusts the height with it when I click my lock button. If I don't have that lock button on, it's just going to adjust the width and not adjust the height, and it's going to look funky, it's going to look out of proportion. Now, Inkscape does a lot when it comes to working with fonts. You know, and when we make a text here in Inkscape, we want to make sure that it actually turns into a vector, because without it being a vector, we can't cut it out. So one easy way to tell if this text is a vector is by pulling out our vector editing tool, that little small triangle, and we click on it and we notice that no vectors actually line up. And that's because it's not a vector at all, at least not yet. One simple way to turn it into a vector is make sure that you have your name selected or that text selected. Go to Path and click Object to Path. We go back to our vector editing tool and we click on it, and now it's a series of vectors. And we'll notice there's a lot of vectors on that B. There's a couple of extra ones that you don't really think you need. You can go in and actually individually delete them if you like. Click and delete, click and delete, click and delete. Or if you want, you can go into Path and click Simplify. And what it does is it removes a lot of those spare vectors, and you can continue to simplify. But remember, as you're simplifying, and I'm hitting Control L, which is the tool for simplify, it's just the keyboard shortcut. You're going to notice it's going to become distorted because Inkscape is trying to simulate the shape with as few vectors as possible, and the fewer the vectors, the less definition you have. So there's a game you really have to play when it comes to definition with vectors. You know, you don't want too many, otherwise it's going to make a sloppy cut, but at the same time, you want just enough vectors to make sure you have a clear understanding of what that shape is going to be. So now we have our vectors. Now let's say we were to cut this out of a square. Let's say, you know, a lot of people make letter or name signs. If we cut Bob out of a square, here's our problem. It'll cut out the insides of the B, the O, the B, and those will drop out. And then it'll actually cut the outside of the B, the O, and the B. And those will also drop out. So you're going to have nothing in there except for the outline of the outer edge of the B, the outer edge of the O, and so on and so forth. And that's not going to create a great cut file. It doesn't look right, and honestly you want a little bit more clarity. And that's why we do something called stenciling, which is adding little tiny pieces of material between these letters and the surrounding material. So let me go ahead and give you an example here. We're going to use the tools that we did last time. I'm zooming in on this B. I'm going to create a vector here, I'm going to create a vector here, and I want to delete the line. Let's delete the line there and delete the line there. Now I had mentioned in a previous video that, you know, having something filled in like this vector is filled in like this, with it being filled in, you're never going to be able to tell whether or not I actually deleted that vector. And it can get rather confusing and frustrating if you don't actually delete, if you're trying to delete or add vectors and it's just not responding the way you want to. And it's largely because you can't see what's going on, because you may have deleted something or not have deleted something and are trying to run a process that just doesn't work because one of those isn't deleted or is deleted. All right. The way we fix that is we go back and we remove the fill. I'm going to go ahead and double click on my fill and stroke. I want to add my stroke in here so that we can see where our vectors are located. And in this case, we'll see that I did in fact delete those vectors. I'll go ahead and do what we did last time in the previous video. I selected 2 nodes and I clicked the tool to join selected with a new endpoint. I want to square select these other 2 nodes and join them again with a new segment. And I can grab and adjust this node to make it fit the way I want it to, you know, make it a little bit more square. The problem with the letter B, and I should mention this, when you're working with it, it can tend to look like the number 13 if you're not careful. So just be mindful of that when you're adding slots to this. I like to keep the center keep the center connected the way it is, and then just remove the 2 outer edges in order to preserve that B shape without making it look entirely like the number 13. And I'm just gonna buzz through here one piece at a time in order to stencil out my B. And now we have a B formed out. And same thing with the O, we can go ahead and do the same thing. I'm gonna double click on my fill and stroke, remove my fill, add the stroke, and zoom in here. Make a vector here, make a vector here, make a vector here, make a vector here, and then go in, delete, go in again, and selecting 2 nodes, delete, and delete, select 2 more nodes, add a line, select 2 nodes, add the line between them. And you'll notice I'm actually moving relatively fast on this, and you too will be able to do this over time as you get familiar with the tools themselves. Select these 2, select those 2 nodes, join line, select these 2 nodes, join line. And there's your O. And you can do the same thing to the B, so on and so forth, if you were cutting it out that way. However, we're going to go back a little bit here. Now that you understand the basics of how to slot a hole, I want to go into making letters and making characters that, let's say you wanted to just cut out the letters B, O, and B, where you're not so much worried about the dropouts at this point because you're just cutting out the physical letters. You want it to do, you know, you've seen a lot of those photos and those pieces of wall art where you have quotes that are all sort of flowery and all tied together. I want to be able to make that here. Now the first thing you're going to notice is if you're going to try to move these letters individually, they're all grouped together, and that's going to be a little bit of a problem for you. So I just like to go and object ungroup them so that I can move them closer and have them overlap. Now, the problem with overlapping them the way that we are overlapping them right now is you'll see that if it tried to cut out the B vector as it is, it'll actually cut into the O, and the O will cut into the other B, so on and so forth. It'll just be a mess of cuts, and you won't be able to do anything with them. So let's, for the sake of editing this, I want to go ahead and just stroke and remove the fill here so we can see what's actually going on. There we have our overlap. Now, one way we can, oh, look at my B. I don't know what that's doing. I'm going to just reconnect my B. And you see that's a very vital point there is without removing that fill, we won't know exactly where our vectors are disconnecting. And so you can import it into SheetCam, into SheetCam, and it'll be a little bit of a mess. You'll think to yourself, well, I don't remember not connecting those lines. I thought those were connected. You go back and try to connect them, and you're having difficulty seeing it. So always try to go and view the vectors in this way. Now, one simple way to join vectors that are overlapped like this is I select them 1, hold Shift, 2, 3. I'm selecting all 3 of these, and I go Path Union. And what this does is it takes every point that you've overlapped in this circle or in these letters and join them together to make one vector file. Now you have one large vector file that when it cuts out now becomes this beautiful name Bob hanging up on the wall without having any terrible cuts or cutting into each other. And that is how you take a text, turn it into vector, and then turn it into something like this. It's a very useful tool. However, I'm going to kind of throw out some other things with text in the next video.